The Frank-Starling mechanism is one of the most famous and impressive findings in the history of cardiac physiology. Professor Otto Frank and some other colleagues already observed the basic principles underlying this concept in late 1800. In early 1900, Professor Starling consolidated some of these findings, and a bit later, both of their names were attached to this mechanism, the Frank-Starling law. Let this great example from more than 100 years ago be a friendly reminder for you whenever you do a literature search in PubMed. Please think twice before you exclude articles that are older than, say, a decade. You might miss out on great findings that are still 100% valid today. Let's get started. In this video, I will explain the function and the regulation of the heart and the entire circulation. Although the heart is very small, we can analyze many different physiological variables. In this chart, you can see how the pressure inside the atria, inside the ventricles, and inside the aorta change during one cardiac cycle. Can you find the key events that explain why valves open and close? After replaying this amazing animation 100 times, the heart serves both the pulmonary circulation and the systemic circulation with blood. The overall physiology, like pressure changes and functionality, is roughly the same, but one key difference is the overall pressure in each part of the system. In the pulmonary circulation, the overall blood pressure is significantly less. Sphygmomanometry is the measurement of blood pressure. And depending on your skills, you could do that either manually with a stethoscope and a manual cuff, or with an automatic device. The concept is still the same. You inflate your cuff around the left arm to completely block the flow of blood through the brachial artery. From that high cuff pressure, you will gradually lower the pressure while you listen for blood flow. As the heart pumps discontinuously, the blood pressure fluctuates between the systolic pressure and the diastolic pressure. Once you have lowered the cuff pressure to be just under the systolic pressure, you will hear the blood flow only for small bursts, exactly when the systolic pressure is reached under the cuff for just a split second. And you have found your first value. Then you gradually lower the cuff pressure even further until you hear no more sound. If that's the case, you know you have brought the cuff pressure just under the diastolic pressure. No more sound means that blood now flows smoothly without any turbulence, so you can record your second value. 120/80 is how we should report these two blood pressure values. The pulse pressure is the difference between those two values, and the mean arterial pressure is the average pressure, but only after you've corrected for the time spent in diastole and systole. As the diastolic phase is usually twice as long as the systolic phase, the mean arterial pressure is 1/3 of the pulse pressure above the diastolic pressure, and therefore lower than the simple mathematical average would suggest. Hypertension is a prevalent disorder and is constantly putting more strain on the entire system. Many factors can play a role in the development of high blood pressure: predisposition, lifestyle, exercise, nutrition. They can all have a direct or indirect effect. In short, blood pressure is increased by an increased blood flow or an increased resistance to the flow. This second component is where many of the physiotherapeutic interventions are focused on, or should be focused on. Let's start with exercise. Right next to Professor Frank and Professor Starling, we can name Professor Fick. Also in late 1800, he came up with a principle that was turned into the following equation, the Fick equation. This equation can be used in different ways, so depending on the variables that we can measure, we can solve the remaining variable. For example, if we know that the AVO2 difference is 5, stroke volume is 70, heart rate is 60, we can calculate the VO2 to be 2 liters per minute. As a physio, you would normally not have measurements of AVO2 difference or stroke volume, but this equation still allows you to reason towards stroke volume, just by measuring heart rate. During steady-state exercise, for example, if we assume that the AVO2 difference is relatively constant at a certain workload, any increase in VO2 can be attributed to an increase in cardiac output. If we have measured heart rate, solving stroke volume is then a piece of cake. Let's dissect this equation and separate each of these components and see how they can be measured and how they can be regulated. Cardiac output is the product of stroke volume and heart rate. You simply multiply the number of beats per minute by the amount of blood pumped out per beat. Just make sure you use the correct units. The heart rate frequency is measured in beats per minute, and at rest values usually range between 50 and 80, while maximum heart rate for an average 20-year-old student is around 200 beats per minute. Resting heart rate can change due to aerobic training. Maximum heart rate is not affected by training, but it will roughly go down with 1 beat every year. Stroke volume is the amount of blood pumped out with every beat. You can measure stroke volume by measuring the amount of blood in the heart after complete filling and diastolic volume, and subtract the amount of blood left inside the heart after complete emptying and systolic volume. Stroke volume can vary between 70 milliliters and 100 milliliters at rest if you compare a sedentary person to an athlete. Maximum stroke volume values can go up to 200 milliliters depending on genetics and training status. The control of stroke volume is done via 3 mechanisms: preload, contractility, afterload. The Frank-Starling mechanism is basically the length-tension relationship of cardiac muscle cells. The more the heart fills with blood, the more cardiac fibers are stretched, and via their position on the length-tension curve, you can see that makes them capable of generating more force. In plain English, the more blood comes in, the more blood flows out. Thanks to this mechanism, extra venous return will therefore increase stroke volume. As a physio, you can think of many practical applications of this in your daily practice. The normal ejection fraction of the heart at rest is around 50%. This means that only half of what's in the heart at the end of the diastolic phase is actually pushed out. The rest of the blood remains inside. Unlike skeletal muscle fibers, your cardiac muscle fibers can increase the force of contraction if extra calcium is made available to these cells. Extra calcium means more cross bridges that can be formed. More cross bridges means more force. More force means more emptying. And diastolic volume decreases. Stroke volume increases, so you can see a higher ejection fraction. The semilunar valve between the left ventricle and the aorta opens when the pressure in the left ventricle exceeds the pressure in the aorta. If the pressure in the aorta is greater than usual, it will also require more pressure from the cardiac muscle cells in the wall of the left ventricle, because the valve will only open if the pressure inside the left ventricle exceeds the pressure on the outside, in the aorta. Again, due to the length-tension relationship that these cardiac muscle cells are in, if they need to generate a higher amount of force, they can only do that if they shorten less, and therefore stroke volume will be less as a result. So via these 3 factors, your body can regulate stroke volume. In this chart, you can see how these components are connected in the regulation of cardiac output. That was it for this video. This was Friday Physiology. I'll see you in the next video.